All right, so we have the motor, well, the short block assembled. As you can see, we got the double X going on here. That's meaning that it's a W72-400. You see this double X in a lot of spots. It's on the center here, double X. See the cam all lubed up. We're actually going with a custom flat tappet cam. This is a custom grind that I came up with that we're going to try out. It should work well with the turbo. And it is a 40 over 400. We got forged Speed Pro pistons in it. And then what we have going on in the front, this is custom to the Turboforce kit, the HO Racing Turboforce kit. What they kind of did with this situation here with this custom timing cover that they made, they capped off the bottom here for where the old outlet was for the lower radiator hose, and then they welded this piece of tubing to the front and kind of notched it out inside. So it requires a custom lower radiator hose, which I did not get with this. So I'll have to make something up to make it work. And then what they did here, this is for the oil drain of the turbo. And I might try to reclock this. I don't like how it's almost horizontal. You're relying on gravity to drain the oil back into the oil pan. And you can see they built up all this area with weld. Basically, it was like this. They filled it in so that they could drill and tap for the fitting, which was pretty interesting. But we lucked out that the timing cover was actually in really good shape and that we could reuse it. So right now, this is as far as we got so far. Next up is we're going to be putting the cylinder heads on. The cylinder heads are the correct 6X-4. It's a little bit smaller combustion chamber. Those are the correct W72 cylinder heads. They're all rebuilt with just a performance valve job done to them. So we'll be putting those on, and then we can start putting the intake manifold on. The intake manifold, we're actually going to go an aluminum intake manifold. I'll show you that when we get to it. And yeah, start assembling valve train and everything like that so that we can mock up fitment of the turbo. All right, so the way we're tackling this engine build, and actually the whole restoration of the car, we already separated the subframe from it, and this is the engine that was in it. This was a running engine. It currently does run. It's a 1967 Pontiac 400. It has 670 heads, supposedly a Ram Air 4 cam. Looks like it's got the 78 style intake manifold on it with an EGR passage that's been blocked off. Runs pretty good. It's just some of the things on here are not quite right. Carburetor and stuff. I'm not even sure what vintage carburetor it is. Looks like it's got a newer Turbo 350 on the back. Got some headers on it. These are 3-tube headers, actually. I'm not sure what brand they are. Hopefully when I get them off, there'll be a tag on there to tell me. So here's an interesting thing. These are the original valve covers for the car, and as you can see, it has part of the Turboforce HO Racing decal on the valve cover. The other thing to note is that it actually has the modification on it that HO Racing told you to do, and the reason for this is kind of an odd one. If you go and look at the current website for the Turboforce system, they actually showed what the modifications were to install the turbo. Obviously, there's no turbo on this one. And what they had done is they actually raised up the passenger side engine mount bracket. They actually cut it and welded it, and actually the distance between the mounting bolt for the engine mount to where it mounts on the engine block, they raised that about 3/4 of an inch because the exhaust pipe would actually run right in this area next to the manifold for the turbo, because the turbo was mounted very low. That was for clearance. When they did that, the valve cover then on the driver's side hit the power brake booster. So the modification was to cut and actually plate the valve cover on the driver's side. So yeah, technically the whole motor actually sat kind of crooked in the engine bay. So I'm actually trying to get around that. You'll see that later on in other videos or even later in this video. I didn't want the motor to sit in there sideways. We got other modifications that we're doing. So we're going to tear into this because what's going to happen, we're going to disassemble everything and we're going to pull the motor out. But first, after getting the motor and everything out of there, we're going to mock up the new engine and we're going to mock up the turbo. We're going to make sure everything, piping, oil drain, exhaust, everything is where we want it to be. If we have to modify anything on the frame to make it fit better, I want to do that now, because then we're going to take the frame, fully disassemble it, send it out, have it blasted, possibly powder coated or painted, get everything back. We're going to have all new everything, bushings, ball joints. We're probably going to keep these springs because these should be the DKM springs for the Macho car. I'm assuming they're cut based on some of the information I've read of what they did to modify it. So we're probably going to keep the front springs, but we're going to restore everything else, clean it all up, make it look nice, basically reassemble everything into the frame with the new engine, with the turbo, transmission on it, everything hooked up, and we're going to run the engine on this frame, fully restored, ready to bolt into the car. So yeah, let's tear into it. So after a lot of messing around, we got the radiator core support off of the frame. We pulled out the 400 that was in it, which is now on the stand over there. Let's get into a little bit more detail about the turbo itself. HO Racing apparently had two different Ray J turbos available depending on the cubic inch that you were putting it on. There was the regular or smaller turbine housing of the Ray J 301E, and then they had a larger turbine housing, exhaust housing for a larger cubic inch engine. We luckily had two turbos come with the car. One was the original for the 400. The other one happened to be almost a complete kit that was for a 455 and had the larger turbine housing. So we decided to put the larger turbine housing on, or the larger turbine housing turbo on this engine. So what's interesting is how HO Racing designed this system, and I've modified it a little bit. Like I had mentioned before, they raised up the passenger side of the engine to clear the exhaust manifold to run the exhaust pipe off the back of the turbo. I didn't want to do that. I didn't want the engine sitting in there crooked. Plus, we decided to go with shorty headers, so you get a better view here. It's kind of hard to see, but we have shorty Hedman headers on it. And it required a little bit of modification and a lot of fabrication for the exhaust pipe exiting the turbo. Now, it's not the prettiest thing right now. I kind of ground down some of the welds, but there was a lot of angle cuts, not pie cuts, just angle cut mandrel bent piping that was kind of clocked and welded together to make this really contortionistic pipe. So the way they mounted this was they made this plate. So you have this plate here, and it's actually a 4-bolt flange on the back of the turbo. So this plate, not only does it support the turbo, but it was also your exhaust pipe. They had a piece of pipe that was actually welded to this, and it was kind of crush bent and whatever, and it was trying to go under the stock exhaust manifold and whatever. So this is 2.5-inch mandrel bent, and then I just kept cutting and welding and getting it to come over the top next to the control arm, where they actually had the same design here with a slip fit together of the exhaust pipe exit, and then I made it go down. This is again all mandrel bent. We have it coming down and exiting. So this here is going to be our exhaust exiting under the car. This is going to be a V-band clamp. I have another piece of pipe with a 2.5-inch mandrel bent elbow that's going to come down and under, and that's going to exit under the car. Obviously, it'll go to the rest of the exhaust system. The headers themselves, I haven't done any of the fabrication yet on this. The headers themselves, we're going to actually come together in front of the sump of the oil pan, and I'll come around to the front again. And we're gonna keep it like how they did it. They actually came up underneath, and if I can get a good shot here, but basically right in that little V, that little void right there between the control arm and the cross member, they actually had pipe. They merged the two pipes together behind there by the oil pan, came up with a single pipe, and that single pipe came up underneath and fed into the turbo. Now I do have that pipe for the manifolds, but it's beat up pretty bad because it did hang down kind of low and the car was lowered to begin with, so speed bumps were not its friend. So we're going to remake all that at some point. This is the original oil drain, which I did not like because now I reclocked the turbo a little bit. So the original oil drain came out here. You can see the witness mark went into the oil drain, which was, there's a lot of weld there to fill it in, and then they drilled and tapped for an oil drain. But I didn't like how it was going uphill. Oil doesn't drain going uphill. So I reclocked the turbo so it's a little more vertical as far as the feed coming in through the top, which would be the oil feed right here. It's kind of, yeah, oil feed there, and then it's going to drain out the bottom. This is a -10AN, which that's the fitting that it came with up in here. And then I added the -10 with a braided hose. Kind of hard to tell, but it's actually riding along next to the oil pan, and then it's going into the side of the sump, which can't really see. Oh, you can see the brass block there. So I welded in a 1/2-inch NPT fitting into the oil pan, and that's where it's going to drain. So kind of redesigned it a little bit. Hopefully it won't have any oil drain issues. I just don't see how that was the best way to drain the oil out of the turbo with the old way going into the timing cover. But that's where we're at so far. In my opinion, I wouldn't want to mount the turbo there. It's just, there's just a lot of monkeying around trying to place the turbo there. It's just, to me, it's a little too low because of the whole oil drain issue and everything. But you know, this is a restoration type deal. We're gonna keep with the spirit of the HO Racing Turboforce kit. But for right now, the motor's gonna get taken out. We're gonna get it off to paint, get the motor painted. In the meantime, I'm gonna be stripping down the chassis. We'll get that blasted and powder coated, and then get into the whole rebuild so that we can start reassembly, final assembly, and get this thing rolling. Hopefully get it started up soon.